Hi guys. This particular set of notes is going to cover the impacts of European colonization on the New World. It is a follow-up to the chart that we had on the causes, the why Europeans went to the New World, that talked about things like looking for resources like gold and going to spread Christianity and that sort of thing. This particular slide that we're starting on has a chart that I believe you have a full copy of in your notes. It's just a different visual of the people that you need to know for this unit and where exactly it was that they went and that sort of thing. So keep that in mind, that's there for you. As always, with flip notes, when you are following along, make sure that you are jotting down things, making notes to yourself, that sort of thing, answering all the questions, etc. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know. So, and the fonts on this are a little bit messed up, so I'm going to work on those as we talk. The European exploration impacts in the Americas include the expansion of the European countries' territories. So, for instance, if you look at this chart, obviously prior to this map, prior to the colonization period, anything in our entire hemisphere, anything in the Western Hemisphere here, would have been completely independent. These are going to be native populations, the Aztecs, the Maya, which disappear around the 1200s, the Inca, any of the American Indian tribes that you learned in, say, like 6th grade. And the Europeans would have been basically limited to the control that they had in Europe, which means that really Russia at that point would have been the largest. Granted, there's not a whole lot of people living sort of in this section of Russia anyway. And then the Ottomans, of course, you can see that dark gray color of the Ottomans is the largest of the countries in the world geographically, around 1500. But this map says 1660, and you can see that the gold color of Spain controls all this New World land from, what does that say, Arizona, New Mexico, all the way to Chile and Argentina, including Florida and most of the Caribbean, while the English, the French, this is the Dutch that are settling in New England. They actually settle in New York. They name it New Amsterdam and then lose it promptly to the British. And you have the Portuguese who've taken land controls in Africa. And of course, you can see the trading ports of India popping up. So Europe is spreading sort of drastically. Oh, you can also see the Philippines here, which is where Ferdinand Magellan met his demise. So that's what it's talking about there, where we're talking about the expansion of territory, is that their land claims in North and South America are obviously growing. The native populations losing control, that sort of thing. You also have the demise of the Aztecs and the Inca. This is just, it's just that there's a lot of death. Largely attributed to Spanish warfare, Spanish guns. But also, if you look at this chart, you can see that, if I draw the pen here, in 1520, the population of Mexico was just shy of 22 million people in 1520. And by, say, 1550, so 30 years later, that number, and I think I just drew that line up a little, is right around 3 million. They lose 18 million people in 30 years in Mexico, almost all of whom are killed by smallpox and this Cocolizzi. I don't know exactly what Cocolizzi is, but smallpox is a disease. It's a pox. So like chickenpox, you get these bumps all over your body, but then they rupture and they burst, and you can get these blood infections, and your body fighting the infection off actually can't handle it, and you die. The American Indians were dying at a rate of about 3 out of every 4 people. The Europeans had built up tolerances largely by this point, but the Aztecs and the Inca and the Native Americans of North America had never been exposed to it before, so they die at much, much higher rates. We also have a rigid class system. This is going to be very similar to the caste system that the Hindus have, a system that you are born into, right? Based on who your parents were. So this caste system, if you can see this chart, breaks you down by the fact that if you're on the top, it's somebody who's born in the Iberian Peninsula. So these are people who are born in Spain or born in Portugal. This is specific to Latin America, right? So this isn't going to be the structure that falls to place in, say, the colonies of Virginia or the Plymouth colony of Massachusetts or what's going on in Canada and the French movement. This is what's happening specifically in the Latin American colonies. The next group of people, so these are the Peninsulars are going to be people that are like royal governors, very high elite people who move from Spain, from Portugal to the New World to be the top, be the control in this dictator system. The next people in control, they're going to hold military offices, they're going to hold government official positions, are the Creoles. So these are the people who are born in Latin America, born in, say, Mexico or Argentina or Peru or wherever, but whose parents are 100% Europeans. So the vast majority of the colonists by a couple of decades in are going to be these Creoles, people whose parents had moved across the Atlantic and then, of course, had gotten married and had children and that sort of thing. So they're born here in the New World. They're New World born, but they are 100% ethnically Spanish or Portuguese. The next group is the mestizos, where one parent, generally the father, was European and the mother generally was Native American. Didn't necessarily have to be that way, but it's almost always going to be that way because more men move across the Atlantic than women. The next group are the mulattoes. So these are European African descended people, the people we traditionally think of as mixed when we describe somebody as mixed today. That's also almost exclusively at the time going to be a European father and an African mother, again, related to the concept that there's more men moving over in the first place. But also, if you think about it in context, if a European woman was having a child with an African man, they would have accused that African man likely of rape and probably executed him, whereas that was also what was happening in the reverse, but the white person would not have been persecuted for it at all. Next is the Africans. There are some free Africans. There are Africans who are brought over and then freed by the end of their life, but obviously the vast majority of the Africans brought over are slaves. And then the Native American populations, the Aztec, the Inca, etc. This particular column here, or bullet here, says the colony's imitation of the culture and social patterns of their parent countries. This is just that your government and your traditions are modeled after the country that you're from. So in Mexico, where the Spanish came, they're going to speak Spanish. They're going to have a Spanish governmental style. They're going to have Spanish customs. Whereas, say, in Virginia with the Jamestown colony, we spoke English, and they created a government with the House of Burgesses that's modeled after the British parliamentary system and that sort of thing. The other is that there's a spread, right? Diffusion means spread of Christianity as Catholics and Protestants from Spain, from France, from England are going to move to the new land, and their faith comes with them. Their culture comes with them, and there's a lot of conversion happening of native people. Remember, we talked specifically about the Jesuits who are converting the populations of the Spanish colonies of New Spain to Catholicism, building schools and that sort of thing. If I make this one a little bit bigger, let's bring it to the front, you can see that in 2010, all the red countries are Christian, this color and this color, where the majority of the population is Christian. This entire continent, North and South America, this entire hemisphere, would not have even heard of Christianity until after 1500, when Europeans had arrived in the New World. but it is definitely the major religion in all of these areas. We can look the same way at Africa as the Europeans travel with colonization, starting with Vasco da Gama through Africa. They do the same thing, as well as Australia, right? And this is New Zealand. So as Europeans move to the New World, then the New World converts to Christianity. You actually could make the same assumption for if the Muslims had been the ones who had made it to the New World instead of the Christians, that this entire section of the world would have been green instead of red. And of course, just as a heads up, this little zoom in circle here, there's not obviously places here in the Southern Indian Ocean, is to highlight that this blue country here is Israel, and it's just saying that Israel goes, if you follow this line, that's a zoom into this circle right sort of in here, so to show you where Israel is. Alright. So obviously the biggest detriment to what happens on the continent of Africa is the transatlantic slave trade. So Europeans began trading with some of the most powerful of the African empires. And one of two things happened. Either Europeans were fighting wars against African nations and then capturing people and selling them into slavery, or in other cases, there are African kingdoms who are doing the same thing. When I pulled this map, it shows where these people were going, right? So the vast majority of them are taken out of sub-Saharan Africa. The Sahara is up here, so the majority of them taken out of sub-Saharan Africa. In these trading ports, like the second bullet says, they create trading ports. They create cities on the coast. So each of these is a name of a European trading port where people were then pulled onto ships and brought to the New World. You can see that the vast majority are headed into Brazil or the Caribbean. So that's not to say, obviously, that they're not going other places. Like, for instance, they were taking people out of the Songhai Empire and sending them to Algeria, where Carthage used to be, or taking them out of northern Senegambia and taking them to France and to Italy and to Portugal, right? But most of them are coming to the Caribbean, where either they are going to be working on plantations and that sort of thing in the Caribbean, or even more likely, they're sold off those ships to a slave trader who then would have brought them to the English colonies here, or into Mexico, or that sort of thing. So that was also happening. A lot of family separation obviously happens when they first put them on the ships, but then even more family separation happens when they get to the Caribbean and then are busted up entirely. Very few families would have stuck together unless it was a mom with a very small child. And a very small child, I'm thinking like younger than toddler. If that child even survived this trip across, which we'll look at in just a second. The other piece is that there's a lot of trade in all of the African resources that are given then straight into the European economy. This, I think, is more powerful than anything else. This is the chart that talks about the Atlantic slave trade. So you can see that they were moving, by the 1780s, 80,000 humans a year were being pulled out of Africa, where more than 2 million die just on the trip alone, where 95% of them go to the Caribbean. So if you want to take a look at that chart on your own time, that's a pretty powerful chart. Going into Africa, these imports, you've got manufactured goods, weaponry, furniture, all kinds of things like that. Cotton turned into cloth, that sort of thing. They're also bringing in corn and peanuts, which become staple foods in Africa, foods that become very entrenched into the diets of Africans. They're also removing, as an export, slaves, obviously, along the Middle Passage, which is that trip across the Atlantic. It's the middle part of the triangular trade, as well as ivory and gold. Meanwhile, in Asia, you have the colonization of various parts of Asia, largely India and the islands, largely based on trading companies. So the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British create these businesses that then impact all the trade. They control the cities, and then they ultimately control the government. All right, if you have any questions, let me know.